By this point in Expect More, we believe that we have them in essence bought into the concept of libraries as learning spaces as more progressive, the idea that it's not just about books but other collections of materials. We've taken them from the obvious and relatively simple messages of libraries are important for people learning and you need to look across library types to the more abstract about the notion of knowledge and how we work within communities and community knowledge. We have two things yet to do. The first is to show that it's not the building or the institution that makes this happen, but the professionals within. The second, which we'll get to in the next chapter, is sort of the action plan, what to do about it if you're in different circumstances. But let's take for a moment this idea of librarians. And we begin with the idea that up to this point, and frankly throughout most of society, our rhetoric is a bit of a lie around libraries. We talk about libraries doing things and having impact and such, and in truth, either they're buildings that exert gravity and shield you from the rain, or they're abstract organizations that don't exist beyond our imagination and an org chart. It's ultimately the professionals and staff within a library that make things happen. This is important that we bring this up. We can't leave library advocacy without including advocacy for librarians, because we've seen in many, many settings where people believe that just having a building or having a collection is sufficient. If we have the collection and building, we can have volunteers, we can have self-checkout, we can get rid of the people. So we have to hammer down that this is the product of people. If it's about knowledge, and knowledge is learning, that's a conversation that happens between people. The idea that it's not, just an object or a book, but an active participant and program that brings that book to the masses. So that's where we're making this switch. Some of the things that are in here for library leaders also impact us as librarians to talk amongst ourselves. And the first is to acknowledge that there really are multiple ways to becoming a librarian, and not all of them involve a master's degree. We have to acknowledge that many people are librarians in rural communities and in urban communities that don't have a library science background, but are still seen, act as, and can be excellent librarians. We also have to talk about those who may never have the title or even recognize they're part of the library field, that we want to have a sense and be part of the library profession. So we're going to take each of these in turn, and we begin with this idea of a librarian for hire. Once again, many folks become librarians because they're hired as librarians. And in many settings, it's because it's too expensive to get someone with a degree. The point of that is to acknowledge it exists and to talk about what's important with these folks is ongoing continuous training. Now, being honest, the necessary thing for any good librarian is ongoing and continuous training, the idea of professional development, engagement. But it becomes really particularly important for those who may not have gone through a library science education or even a form of apprenticeship, that idea of giving people the theory and the skills. So we want to emphasize that if we're hiring non-librarians, we need to make sure they're prepared. Now we move to librarians by a degree. And really the goal here is to answer that perennial question of, you need a graduate degree for that? And the answer is yes. The dilemma that we're trying to address in this section is a dilemma of service. That is, we want to be of service. We want to have the maximum utility and impact for those that we are seeking to work with, our communities to be part of, to aspire. To do that, we make things easy. Part of the job of a service professional is to make things easy. At the same time, sometimes we make it so easy that it becomes transparent on how our role in it made it easy. It wasn't easy on its own, it was our role that made it easy for you. Now, in some fields, this is not that hard of a case to make. Not many people look at doctors and go, gee, I could take my temperature, what's so hard about this? Or lawyers going, look, I can talk for a long time in front of a judge, what's the problem? These professions have done a good job of saying, look, it's important that we have a human being here, they're well trained, they're experts, that's important. With librarianship, we have to find that right mix as well, that idea that we are making this easy, we're being of service, and yet it takes a lot of work, expertise, and background, continuous training, to make that happen. So our goal in this section is to have the reader, to have our communities understand the complexity of librarianship, not to become little librarians, but to acknowledge that expertise is important and we need these stewards in our library programs. So we begin talking about that shield. We begin talking about the fact that librarians aren't just about libraries, they can be anywhere. They can be working in Google, and they can be working in for-profits and not-for-profits as consultants. Many people think of the idea of the librarians are bound to this building of a library. Well, at one time, that's what accountants were. Accountants were people who worked in counting houses. If you're a big fan of Dickens, the notion of Scrooge was running a counting house. And people would bring their records to the counting house to get the accounting done. And pretty soon the businesses realized, why don't I just hire these people and bring them to me? And not only can they just work on my records, but they can help us plan in the future. And we now see the notion of an accountant as someone who works anywhere. The future may well be the same number of libraries, possibly even fewer, but more librarians. And in the field, we need to think about, are we okay with that? How would that work? But we go through, once again, talking about the complexity with history, and we get into this notion of reductionism. Now, reductionism is brought up here for two reasons. One, to get people, once again, to think differently about libraries. One, that librarians are thinking about more than just, oh, it's got a number, let me attach it. But two, that part of what we're breaking from the former nostalgic view is that everything in its place, that this is about communities and conversation and learning, and that's about complexity, and that's about gray zones between ideas and topics and how people talk about them. So what we're trying to address here is, firstly, for them to understand there's expertise here, and they need to think about it that way and depend on librarians to provide it. But we also want to equip board members and non-librarians that sometimes librarians will use reductionism and classification and cataloging our skills as a way to avoid change. There's an old joke that people in information technology never tell you no, they just tell you three-letter acronyms until you run away. Well, as librarians, we can do it as well. We can throw the Dewey Decimal Classification and the idea of collocation and why collocation matters and should it be in a hierarchical system versus an inductive system, right? We can do it too. So our goal here is to say it's complex, it's important, we know it, but as librarians, we need to work with you because your language, your community, how you see information is vitally important. So we bring that in. Note here that I talk about when I'm giving analogies to other professions, I keep bringing up lawyers and doctors and engineers and high performance, high status professions because that's who we want to be associated with. The last thing to talk about is the notion, well, before I leave that this complexity, ending the notion of reductionism, complexity, etc., is that what we really want to talk about is the ultimate negative effect of reductionism. Is as you divide everything into smaller and smaller categories, you can do that to your own organization. And you can begin to isolate yourself from larger and complex problems, which is what people really need solved. So if you think about it, well, the library does resources, and the school does education, and the Chamber of Commerce does business. But we know that they're all connected and interconnected. And that's a complex soup. And that when you add multiple stakeholders together, it gets complex, but you can do much more than any individual group or a set of groups working in isolation. So that's the last one, which is take this as a sense of we want to tackle really complex, important problems. We see that, for example, in the strategic plans of Richland County Public Library here in South Carolina, where they talk in their strategic plans about taking on poverty and creating a resilient economy. We see that in Gina Millsap's shop in Topeka, Kansas, where she's working with the United Way to talk about readiness for kindergarten and reading and education, that it's not just what we do in our building, but how we team as a community to solve complex problems. The last one I talk here briefly is Librarian of Spirit, and it's here briefly because really we're trying to create an attractive way that we want our supporters to see themselves as librarians by spirit. We want the idea of the board member, the provost, the principal, the teacher to feel that in essence they have a stake and they have a little librarian in them and they want to promote and support that. I then go into the notion of Salzburg and the Salzburg curriculum. This is giving specifics. So once again, just as we did with the notion of the abstraction of libraries as learning and communication and such, and then I had to give them a series of specifics from the library garden and embedded librarians, we have to do the same thing here. We said, look, librarians are complex and etc., but what should they really know? What should we as a board member or principal, what have you, how should we evaluate them? And that's where we're bringing this idea of the Salzburg curriculum that talks about things like having technological literacy, talking about organizing and maintaining materials and collection, still going ahead and showing that that can be beyond books and materials and can include things like fishing poles and tribal robes. And really then getting to the point of talking about the idea of we need them to be in community connection. A community should be a better place because it contains a library. Better means change from how it is now to something better. We need to talk about libraries engaged in positive social action, that they are transformative, that it's not just about a transactional relationship. You come in, you get your stuff, you sit and read. It's about transformation. You come in and you're better. You can do more. You can have a greater positive effect. And so, once again, we're really getting people to look at librarians now in a new light, just like we were asking them to look at libraries as organizations. We need those two things paired. We're pushing them to think beyond it. And so then we move into the notion of what librarians do and how they facilitate, talking about the idea of working in social interactions, learning about different things. And the trick, as I point out in this annotation, is between we want them to know that we're in the learning business, but we're not duplicative of what teachers do in a classroom, that we need both of those things. So we're threading a bit of a needle here and saying learning is more important than any one profession, but we have an important role to play in that panoply of professions. So that's what we're doing. We're sitting here talking and showing about learning and the specific ways that we can do it, and ultimately talking about how librarians are a bridge across multiple institutions to solve complex problems in our organizations. So the last thing that we say in this, and then we leave this chapter, is that notion that how we uniquely define librarians. So we've said, look, we need libraries. Libraries are different. They're about learning. And now we've said, and you need librarians because that's not just a simple thing that anyone can do. There's expertise, there's value, there's important skills that are involved in that. And the last thing we want to do is give them a really concrete feel for the kinds of people they should be looking for and supporting in this. So we talk about the idea that a librarian is a mission to improve society through helping knowledge creation in our communities, learning. We do it through our values and principles, the idea of being intellectually honest, not unbiased, not neutral, not sitting to the side, but active and engaged and intellectually honest. And we do it through our means of facilitation, our skills, if you will. So we bring them all the way through the idea of now we have a complete picture of a library. It is a learning organization and institution. It is full of tools such as books and databases and fishing rods and spaces and rooms. And we now have the people who caretake it and run and push that platform forward, which are librarians. And so that's where we're going to end this chapter. And then we're going to pick it up and say, all right, so now let's see where you are and where you need to go.